We're looking at the crucifixion narrative then in Matthew's Gospel, and the narrative extends from verse 27 through to verse 61. And this is Matthew chapter 27. Now, it's a long read, but you have your Bibles with you, I'm sure. So let's read this crucifixion narrative then. Matthew 27, and we'll begin at verse 27. Okay, so Matthew 27 and verse 27. Then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the praetorium and gathered the whole garrison around him. And they stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him. When they had twisted a crown of thorns, they put it on his head and a reed in his right hand. And they bowed the knees before him and mocked him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews." Then they spat on him and took the reed and struck him on the head. And when they had mocked him, they took the robe off him, put his own clothes on him, and led him away to be crucified. Now as they came out, they found a man of Cyrene, Simon by name. Him they compelled to bear his cross. And when they had come to a place called Golgotha, which means place of a skull, they gave wine mingled with gall to drink. But when he had tasted it, he would not drink. Then they crucified him and divided his garments, cast in lots, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the prophet. They divided my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. Sitting down, they kept watch over him there. And they put up over his head the accusation written against him. This is Jesus, the King of the Jews. Then 2 robbers were crucified with him, one on the right and another on the left. And those who passed by blasphemed him, wagging their heads and saying, "You who destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself. If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross." Likewise, the chief priests also, mocking along with the scribes and elders, said, "He saved others. Himself he cannot save. If he is the King of Israel, let him now come down from the cross, and we will believe him. He trusted in God. Let him deliver him now if he will have him. For he said, I am the Son of God." Even the robbers who were crucified with him reviled him with the same thing. And so from the 6th hour until the 9th hour, there was darkness over all the land. And about the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, saying, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani," which means, when translated, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Now, some of those who stood there, when they heard that this man is calling out for Elijah, they said. Straight away, one of them ran and took a sponge, filled it with sour wine, and put it on a reed, and offered it to him to drink. The rest said, "Let him be. Let us see if Elijah will come to save him." And Jesus cried out again with a loud voice, and yielded up his spirit. Then behold, the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and the earth quaked, and the rocks were split, and the graves were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised, and coming out of the graves after his resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many. Now when the centurion and those with him who were guarding Jesus saw the earthquake and the things that happened, they feared greatly, saying, "Truly this was the Son of God." And many women who followed Jesus from Galilee, ministering to him, were there looking on from afar, among whom were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Joses, and the mother of Zebedee's sons. And so when evening had come, there came a rich man from Arimathea, named Joseph, who himself had also become a disciple of Jesus. This man went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Then Pilate commanded the body to be given to him. And when Joseph had taken the body, he wrapped it in a clean linen cloth and laid it in his new tomb, which he had hewn out of the rock. And he rolled a large stone against the door of the tomb and then left. But Mary Magdalene was there, and the other Mary, sitting opposite the tomb. So that's Matthew's account of the crucifixion. And the way Matthew tells the crucifixion is very unusual, and it's very individual. What Matthew does is he divides the crucifixion into 4 stories. I've used the word narratives before, and that is the best word. So we may feel a bit sort of uncomfortable with the word, but let's continue to use it. So there are 4 narratives that make up the crucifixion account. And each of the narratives is from a people point of view. So I need to make something very clear right at the start. And that is, in a sense, Matthew doesn't focus on Jesus on the cross specifically. What he does is he looks at people and people who are around the cross. And Matthew focuses on people. And if we were to, and I would never suggest we do it, but if we were to stage the crucifixion story or make a film of the crucifixion story as Matthew tells it, then the camera wouldn't focus on the cross at all. We would all know that Jesus was on the cross, but the camera would focus on the people. And you only hear Jesus twice. You hear him cry out the cry of dereliction, and you hear his last breath. But the account focuses attention on the people who are around. And Matthew does that very deliberately. So there are 4 narratives. And what I'll do is I'll just outline those narratives, and then we look at them in more detail. So what you have, first of all, is what's known as the soldier's narrative. From verse 27, and that narrative extends to verse 37. So Matthew is focusing on what the soldiers are doing. And if you look at those 10 verses, the word that is repeated again and again and again is the word they. They stripped him, they twisted a crown of thorns, they put it on his head, they bowed the knee, they spat on him, they mocked him, they took the robe, they came out. Do you get the idea? Matthew is emphasizing the role of the soldiers, what they did, how they behaved. And that narrative extends to verse 37. And the final thing that the soldiers do is they make the title. Now, remember, the title is the accusation, it's the reason for the crucifixion. If you like, it's a legal notice for people to see why a person's being crucified. They make that title in verse 37. This is Jesus, the King of the Jews. And that's where the soldier's narrative ends. The second narrative that we have is known as the robber's narrative. And that's from verse 38 to verse 44. And do you remember the idea of bracketing or framing? So that's when 2 verses have the same word or they have the same idea. And those 2 verses then function like brackets in a sentence. So in verse 38, we have then 2 robbers. And then verse 44, even the robbers. So the word robbers forms a frame around those verses. And that frame becomes the robber's narrative. And we look at that in more detail because that is a very moving and very important part of how Matthew tells the crucifixion story. So we've got the perspective of the soldiers, then we have the robber's narrative, and then we have the third narrative, and that's from verse 45 down to verse 56. And that's known as the watcher's narrative. There are a group or groups of people who are watching. They're watching Jesus on the cross. So for example, verse 47, some of those who were watching there. And then as you go down to verse 55, many women who followed Jesus from Galilee, ministering to him, were there looking from afar. And Matthew is emphasizing how the cross has become a spectacle. There are different groups looking at what is going on. Now, remember I said to you, Matthew doesn't show us the cross directly. The cross isn't in focus. The people are. We are watching people watching. We are looking at people who are looking at the cross. So that's known as the watcher's narrative. And then finally, you get the fourth of those stories. And that's from verse 57 through to verse 61. And that fourth narrative is Joseph's narrative. Joseph of Arimathea, the man who had spent time making a cave in the rock. If you look at verse 60, he laid it in his new tomb, which he had hewn out of the rock. So this man has been spending weeks, maybe even longer, in preparing a burial place for Jesus. And that's so hugely significant. How did Joseph know that this is what he was to do? How did he know that he would even get the body of Jesus? Matthew doesn't tell us that, but it's what he wants us to reflect on as we look at his account of the crucifixion. So there are four stories then, okay? And I hope you're able to follow me. We can take our time because each of these four stories are then divided. So each story in its own rights is then divided into further elements. So let's take a look at the soldier's narrative. So the soldier's narrative, as we said, is from verse 27 down to verse 37. And this is the most harrowing of Matthew's four stories. And we have the idea of the mocking of Jesus. That's how the account begins. Even though Pilate had found no fault with him, Pilate's soldiers then descend into this moment of savagery and violence as they dress Jesus up as a king and then subject him to this mockery and this torture. And Matthew simply describes what happens. The mockery forms the first part of the soldier's narrative. And then the second part is the journey to the cross. Verse 32. They set out on the journey, and the soldiers then compel Simon of Cyrene to help Jesus carry the cross. Now, that is meant to be an image of brutality. They are taking an innocent man like Simon and compelling him, forcing him at the point of a whip to carry the heavy end of the bar to the cross that Jesus himself was carrying. And they then journey. So you can see from verse 32 to 34, you've got this idea of a journey from the Praetorium out to Golgotha. And then when they arrive at Golgotha in verse 34, and that journey comes to an end, they offer Jesus sour wine mingled with gall to drink. And that is an anesthetic. It's like a form of pain relief. It's designed to numb the person being crucified to the horrors of the cross. But of course, Jesus refuses this, because Jesus understands that he needs to experience the full horror of the physical suffering of the cross, and of course the spiritual suffering of the cross, if he is to make atonement. So he refuses to take that pain relief. That's the journey motif. And then from verse 35 to verse 37, we have the cross itself. And what we have then is the fulfillment of Scripture in the moment of crucifixion. And throughout Matthew's Gospel, it's hugely important to him that what he is telling us is the fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecies. And Matthew's very matter of fact, then they crucified him. He doesn't go into the details of the horror. He simply states it and then moves on to the fact that they divide his garments, and that's how the Scriptures are fulfilled. These soldiers then sit down, and they sit down in order to watch, if you like, but just to wait really for the events to be over, and they then put that title in its place. Now, throughout the soldier's narrative, Jesus is presented as passive. He doesn't speak. He doesn't resist. He is someone who, and it's really difficult to get this idea across, he's somebody who Matthew is almost shielding from our view. It's the soldiers that we see, but we know exactly what is happening. And the reason for that is Matthew is presenting Jesus as the fulfillment of the prophecy of Isaiah in Isaiah 53. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is dumb, so he opened not his mouth. Here is Jesus offering no resistance, but submissively and quietly obeying the will of God, fulfilling the Scriptures, and then going to the cross. And that's then where the soldier's narrative ends in verse 37. Let's take a little look, if we can, at the robber's narrative then, that you have from 38 to 44. And if you take a look at that, you can see, can't you, that that account also divides up further. It subdivides, rather, I guess, into different moments. And each moment is of huge importance. So just take a look then from 38 to 44. And the way Matthew presents the crucifixion story, the robbers are silent. We know that from other accounts, the robbers do speak. They both mock Jesus to begin with, and then one of them asks Jesus to remember him when he enters into his glory. But here, the robbers say nothing. What Matthew does is he points our attention to those who have gathered now around the cross. It's almost as if the crowd has arrived at this moment, at least according to the way that Matthew tells the account. So Matthew focuses on the gathered crowd and how the crowd behaves. And you can see that Matthew wants us to be very clear that in verse 39, the crowd begins to blaspheme, but the scribes and the chief priests and the elders start to mock. Look at verse 41. So Matthew makes a distinction between blaspheming Jesus and mocking him. And as you look at the words, what is said by this crowd, there are three areas in which, or three ways in which, this crowd heap agony upon the Lord Jesus Christ. And it's very clearly told us by Matthew. So to begin with then in verse 40, the crowd begin to mock the claim Jesus made about his resurrection. Destroy this temple, and within 3 days I will rebuild it. You who destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself. Verse 40. They pick up on the reason that he was charged. Remember, we looked at it earlier. They begin to take his own words and throw it back at him. So it's not so much the physical temple, because the physical temple isn't destroyed, is it, at this point? They are mocking his idea of resurrection. That's how the crowd starts. But then the chief priests and the elders, they change, don't they, the subject. They change the nature of their mockery. And the first thing they then talk about is they mock the way Jesus healed others. They mock his ministry. He saved others. Let him see if he can save himself, verse 42. If he is the King of Israel. His entire ministry of healing and delivering and restoring others becomes the grounds on which these leaders start to torture him with their words. They are ridiculing and pointing out his futility. What he was able to do for others, he is not able to do for himself. And then you get the third level at which they start to mock and torment Jesus in verse 43. And this is the most personal of the ways in which they could torment Jesus when he was on the cross. And they begin to ridicule his relationship with God the Father. He trusted in God. Let God deliver him if he will have him. Can you hear in those words the acid, the disgust, the contempt that these leaders have for Jesus? If God will have him, let's see if God will deliver him. So they've moved from the fact that they are mocking his resurrection, they are mocking his ministry, and then finally, the ultimate form of mockery, they mock his relationship with God. And that's how that story then ends. The robbers join in, we are told, but they are silent. These are very difficult passages to look at, aren't they? But you get the sense that there's going to be movement. We start with the horrors of the soldiers. We then go on to the crowd and how the crowd behave. But when you move on to what's known as the Watchers narrative, things begin to change. So there are different groups of watchers looking at Jesus, but we only see these guys at the end of the crucifixion. So we've seen the crowd at the beginning in the robbers narrative, but the next part of the story takes us to the end of the crucifixion experience. And the in between are these hours of darkness. So verse 45, from the 6th hour until the 9th hour, there was darkness. In that darkness then, the voice of Jesus is heard as he pierces the darkness with his cry, my God, why have you forsaken me? And then we see these watchers. And the first group of watchers, verse 47, some of those who stood there, when they heard that, said, this man is calling for Elijah. The sense now is all the mockery has stopped. And there's a sense of expectation. What's going to happen? We've heard this cry. What's now going to happen? And so they wait. Verse 49, leave him alone. Let's see. Can you see the emphasis on watching? Let's see if Elijah will come to save him. So the first group of watchers are presented to us as curious. They simply want to see what will happen. They want to see the events, how they unfold. Then you get Jesus crying out again with a loud voice, verse 50, and that's the moment when Jesus offers his life to God as an atonement for our sins. I want to leave the veil, if I can, and come back to the veil and to the bodies. So let's leave verses 51 to 53 for a moment. But let's look at the second group of watchers. And the second group now are the same soldiers we met in the first narrative. Verses 54, verse 54. When the centurion and those who were with him, who were guarding Jesus, saw the earthquake and the things that had happened, they feared greatly, saying, truly, this was the Son of God. This group of watchers are beginning to acknowledge who Jesus is. So they've gone from mockery and torture through the events of the cross. They've reached the point now where at least one of them, but more than one of them, is able to acknowledge that here we have Jesus, the Son of God. It's in the past tense, so what we have is a limited understanding. But nonetheless, can you see that movement? There's been some kind of change. There's been some shift in the whole focus of these soldiers. They're the second group of watchers. And then finally, we have the women, verses 55 and 56. They are at a distance, but these women are now introduced by Matthew as the ones who had been ministering to him, the ones who had been serving him. They are watching the events, but they're going to continue. And they're going to be present when he's taken down. They're going to be present in order to observe his burial. So again, you see, what we are having Matthew introduce the notion of believing. We start with mockery, then blasphemy, but now as the cross comes to its close, the focus has shifted on believing people, the believing women and what they are prepared to do. And then the ultimate story, then the last one, Joseph, a believing man, and what this believing man is able to do. So verse 57 to 61. When evening had come, there comes this rich man. He's been waiting throughout the day for his moment. Pilate commands that the body be entrusted to Joseph. He takes the body, wraps it in a linen cloth, and takes it to the tomb, rolls the stone against the tomb, and there's the women again. The women are watching what's happened, and they sit opposite the tomb and they wait. So it's a difficult crucifixion narrative. But can you see it's told from the point of view of people? And that point of view changes. It changes in the soldiers, and we end the crucifixion story in a totally different place to where we began. We begin with mockery and torture, but we end with reverence and with belief and with expectation. And that's what Matthew wants you to acknowledge in the drive or the direction of his crucifixion account. Okay, so what I want to do now and to finish is to look at verses 51 through to 53. Let me read them again, okay, because this event is right at the heart of what Matthew is doing in telling us the crucifixion narrative. 51 to 53. Then behold, the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and the earth quaked, and the rocks were split, and the graves were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised, and coming out of the graves after his resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many. Now, first thing to say about these verses is, do you get the sense of urgency? Matthew is piling one thing upon another in the way he describes it. And I've tried to convey that sense in our reading. So look at it again. The veil was torn, the earth quaked, the rocks split, the graves were open, the saints were raised and coming out. It's this kind of gathering climax of one thing after another that happens with great speed and great drama. The veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. There are two curtains in the temple, and the debate here is which of these curtains was torn in two. There are two Greek words used, one for the temple as a whole and one for the holy place. And it's the meaning of which Greek word is used that helps us to understand which curtain is being torn here. And the general idea, most people would say, that the curtain which is torn is the curtain that separates the Holy of Holies, the place where God was, or God is, I guess, in current terms, where the presence of God was found, hidden. God was secret, God was separate, God was behind the veil. Nobody had access to God, only the high priest once a year. So it's that sense of the mysterious, hidden, shut away God that Matthew has in mind here. And when the veil is torn from top to bottom, can I say to you, what we have there is the unveiling of God. We have God suddenly being revealed. Many of us will think, and it's okay, that this tearing of the veil means we now have access to God. That's fine. But the unveiling of God is Matthew's big idea here, that the veil is torn and God is seen. So it's not primarily us having access to God. It is God being revealed to us, being revealed to everyone. It's a revelation of the presence of God. It's a breaking out of the presence of God from the confines of the holy place and into men and women generally. It's a revelation of the person and the glory of God for all to see. That's what we have here. It's the equivalent, or perhaps I should say, a taste of what's to come in the future. Because all the subsequent events are resurrection events. Take a look at it again. The earth quaked, the rocks were split, the graves were opened, the bodies were raised. That's going to happen at the second coming. When Jesus appears a second time in his glory, that's what you're going to see. You're going to see the dead raised. You're going to see the graves opened. You're going to see the earth quaking. You're going to see this creation ending. So what you have here, when Jesus offers up his spirit and dies, you have a foretaste of the great resurrection, the ultimate resurrection that's going to happen when Jesus is revealed from heaven at the sound of a trumpet. He's going to be revealed in all his glory for all to see. He's going to come with his angels. The hidden Son of God is going to be on display in all his majesty. That's in the future. This year is a foretaste of that. So it's a revelation of the glory of God that the tearing of the veil is giving us. Now, if you think, look, Neil, it's about us having access to God, that's fine, of course it is. But the way Matthew tells the story and all those mysterious events that come along, the resurrection of the dead, is showing you that here is a revelation of God, the God that nobody had seen, the God who'd been hidden away for centuries, this remote and mysterious and hidden God, by the death of Jesus, breaks from that. And this God is now there for all. He is now visible for all. He is now available to all. He is now present to all. It's this moment, I'm almost tempted to say Big Bang, in which God breaks out and he's there now, no longer hidden and confined to the holy place. but there for all, for men and women who through Christ will now know this God and will see him. That, I think, is the whole thrust of what Matthew is telling us. It is God breaking out and available to all through the person of his Son, Jesus Christ. And that is because of what Jesus accomplishes on the cross. He has been forsaken by God. He then offers up to God his life, his death, his obedience, himself. He offers that to God. And then in so doing, he makes a new way for men and women to come, not through the temple anymore. The temple is finished. There's no need for it. God isn't found there any longer. God is now free and available. And men and women can know this God. And the temple will become people. And it'll become living stones with Christ the foundation and God's presence dwelling amongst us all. It's the openness of God that we now have in the way that Matthew tells this crucifixion story. One last thing. After the crucifixion and the burial, we have the final actions of those who've opposed Jesus. And you see it from verse 62 to verse 66. They are going to make sure that Jesus stays in the tomb. They remember that he had said that he would break free after 3 days. And so they post a guard. And they asked Pilate's permission to post a guard and to seal the tomb, to make doubly certain no disciple can come along and steal the body and then tell the lie that Jesus is raised. And you see it, don't you? Verse 63, "Sir," this is to Pilate, "we remember while he was still alive how this deceiver said, 'After 3 days I will rise.' Therefore command that the tomb be made secure until the 3rd day, lest the disciples come by night and steal him away and say to the people, 'He has risen from the dead.'" So every effort is made to keep Jesus in the tomb and to prevent the disciples from making any claim that the resurrection has been accomplished. That's how the whole day ends in up to verse 66. The scene is then set for the resurrection. And what I'd like to do on Sunday morning, Easter Sunday morning, is read Matthew's account of the resurrection. But I want to think more broadly with you about the resurrection. And I want to suggest 3 things on Easter Sunday morning. The resurrection is revelation. The resurrection is about facts. And then the resurrection is about the right moment. And let's take those 3 ideas up on Sunday and explore them together on Sunday morning in the resurrection accounts. So that's Sunday morning. So thank you very much.